want to say hello to everyone and introduce myself. I'm Clotilde Redfern. I'm the director of the Rory Pack Trust. Thank you very much for joining us for this Zoom webinar, which is the second in the series we're calling The Business of Freelancing. So we had our first webinar focusing on pitching a couple of months ago, which you can still access on our events page on our website. This is the second one, all about navigating negotiation for freelance journalists. And the third, we have a third one coming up entitled Show Me the Money, which is all about how to manage your budgets and financial planning as a freelance journalist. So the reason we started this series on the business of freelancing is because we have seen that there is an inextricable link between freelance finances and freelancers' safety. The Rory Pack Trust is primarily concerned with freelance journalist safety. We've been running an assistance fund for journalists in crisis for many years, and this is a new addition that we've added to the non-financial support that we offer freelance journalists, which we started since the pandemic when we couldn't actually offer in-person courses. And this has proved to be a real success, and lots of people from all over the world have been tuning in. So thank you for joining us. I'm Clotilde Redfern, the director of the Rory Pack Trust. My colleague, Leanne Dimiterko, will stay for the duration of the webinar. I will just introduce our hosts, Jenny and Wudan. Jenni Gritters and Wudan Yan are together the hosts of a podcast called The Writers Co-op, and they will be holding the conversation today. Between them, they have almost 2 decades of experience in journalism, so they have lots to share with you. They've planned to give you a half-hour presentation on navigating negotiation in today's media landscape, and then be available to all of you for half an hour of Q&As.
We're based in the US, but we know that actually contracts are a little different for y'all in the UK. So we will talk about, even getting a contract, it sounds like is a little bit more tricky. So we'll talk about that, but there are also other things you can negotiate, right? It's not just the contract, it's the pay, it's the scope of work, it's the deadline. It's the expenses being covered. There's a whole bucket of things that you can ask for, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Let's back up a second, Jenny, and kind of define what counts as a contract. And with the understanding that, based on our research, the major publishers in the UK will send writers a contract, but in other settings, it's a lot less formal. So what counts as a contract?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I do want to say, I just dropped some links in the chat. One of those links is to an online course we have all about contracts. So we'll touch on contracts, I think, in some ways today, but we have this whole expansive class where you get legalese that you can use to have these negotiation conversations. And we worked with the lawyer on that. So I'm going to drop that in there just because that's the big pot. We're going to touch on it a little bit today. But yeah, so a contract is an agreement between two people that says the scope of work, the pay, the timeline. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a big old piece of legalese. What we learned when we started investigating this for ourselves is that a Twitter DM can count as a contract, an email can count as a contract. Any sort of agreement that stipulates like what you're doing with that other person is actually legally enforceable. And that's the important thing here, is that you're signing something that helps you get paid and dictates what the project looks like, which is good news, right? I think it's good news. I think actually the less we sign, the better it can be in a lot of cases, especially in the US. If you're not signing this big old meaty thing where you're giving away all your rights to your story and you don't own it, and you're signing an indemnity clause that's terrible, actually having this sort of handshake agreement that occurs in some other form, you do want it to be written, but having that kind of agreement is sometimes beneficial to the freelancer because you actually haven't signed all these bigger things. Sometimes we don't love it because there's not enough information around, something like payment terms, but something as basic as that does count as a contract. That's my spiel.
So
what else, Dan?
Right. No. So that stipulates if you, the freelancer, file that scope of work by that due date, you should deserve the payment in full. There's no kill fee. You delivered the work. There was no agreement on a kill fee. you invoice for the full fee. So as much as we are educating other freelancers about this, I think like editors also need to be educated about this as well, because they can, you know, if they don't know how a contract works, or that an email with all these terms counts as a contract, right? Then like, I think it's on you, the freelancer, to educate that individual you're working with, for better or worse. So that's kind of the emotional tax on all of this. Let's see, what are some key, so we want to zoom into contracts a little more too. Actually, or how did you start negotiating, Jenny? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, this is a good question. So for me, I got laid off from the New York Times, which was fun, in a surprise layoff, which I know is the story of media these days, and had a chance to figure out what I wanted to do because I got a little bit of severance pay. And during that time, I had a good therapist who was like, what if you didn't take a full-time job? What if you decided to make your own job and essentially freelance? And she assigned me a business plan. And I was like, this is not something that I would think of as being attached to freelancing. Turned out to be the best exercise ever because it had me define how much I needed to make, how much I wanted to work, what that looked like. So for me, my negotiations started because I knew my rates. I knew that I had student loans. I lived in an expensive city, and I actually needed to be making $50 an hour or more. And so when a client would approach me or I'd have a conversation, and they would say, we pay, 20 an hour, I would say, unfortunately, that's not going to work for my business plan. Like, I can't be a freelancer if I'm getting paid that. So that's where the conversation started, I think, out of necessity for me. But at first it was really scary. I'm very much a people pleaser. There's definitely this scarcity mentality, right? If you push back, maybe you won't get the assignment at all. And so my pushback started really small, asking for $5 an hour more. I didn't negotiate contracts until probably a couple years into freelancing, mostly because I didn't even understand what the terms meant or what I was really signing. Now I negotiate all of these things, but I actually think it's a pretty slow trickle. And the thing I'm most likely to negotiate these days is actually scope. So if someone's budget can't really increase, I say, okay, great. I really want to work with you. Let's figure out how I can do basically less work or a smaller story in order to be compensated appropriately, right? So that's actually my most common thing, as well as contract stuff these days. So yeah, what about you, Wudan? When did you start negotiating? That's a very good question.
I negotiated an internship rate when I was just starting out and living in New York City. I wasn't expecting to get an internship because I saw a lot of these positions go to people who went to a master's program or journalism school. And I didn't have that kind of education at all. I was just freelancing and sailing in the wind for a while. And at the time, I would have had to give up a full-time job that paid me a livable wage in New York City. And I think they were going to start me off on $10 an hour. And I negotiated to $12.50. That was a really small ask, and I got that raise. My editor was like, let me check with HR, and came back and was like, yes, thumbs up, we're all good to go. So that was a good little boost. And then with regards to contracts, so after that internship wrapped up, I moved overseas and developed a lot of experience working with fixers and translators and in post-conflict zones. And I realized that I was getting screwed over a lot on rate and also in my contracts and how I was protected or not protected in my contracts. And all of that was a learning experience for me to go back in and realize that, there's a higher cost of reporting for me in these more hostile environments, or I wanted a graduated payment scheme for stories that took a long time because it's not financially feasible for me to wait a year until I got paid to bring a story from the pre-reporting to pitch accepted to publication. So that's kind of where I found myself working on fighting back more on contract terms and educating myself. And it wasn't until I started working on a pretty sensitive story early on in my career too. And I immediately went to a local law school that has like a lawyer of the arts association, and they had me come in for 15 minutes. I paid them $20. They were all folks who were studying like media law, but they weren't actual lawyers, so I didn't have to pay like $400 an hour. But they sat me down and walked me through like what an indemnity clause was and what everything meant, and also helped me propose better language. And that has basically scaled to the point where I'm like super comfortable. And if I don't know what something means, I'll look it up, I'll ask a lawyer. And so people usually say like, oh, Wudan, you've basically learned how to be your own lawyer. And part of me is like, yes, but I also don't know everything. I only know like what I need to know in order to better negotiate contracts.
Yeah, I love this. I think we talk a lot about in our podcast, and both of us coach freelancers as well. And we talk a lot about how this is a muscle. It's like you go to the gym, like when you first start doing a certain exercise, it's going to feel really uncomfortable and like you're not going to be able to lift very much. And over time, you just get so used to doing this that it's actually sort of second nature to say, oh, actually, this is like a bad clause. Like I find myself explaining this to editors a lot. Actually, like, do you know what this means? Because this is actually really bad. And they're like, oh, I guess it is bad, right? So it becomes almost reflexive, but it takes quite a bit of time. So I think maybe, Wudan, it's probably worth it to talk about how to negotiate, like some sort of practical tips on that process. And then we can sort of get into the nitty gritty of pay and contracts and all that jazz. But do you want to tell me how you usually start that conversation, what it looks like, what language you use, all that?
For sure. Yeah. So when I get a contract, I ask the person who sent me like, hi, I'd like to negotiate some terms. Should I do that with you, legal, someone else? And they point me to the right direction. Then I say, hello, I would like to negotiate the following terms. And I basically, now I have an assistant who helps me do a first pass because they know what terms of the contract I'm looking for. And they will send me a memo about red flags to look out for, things to possibly negotiate based on my needs that I've communicated to them. And so what I do is copy and paste all the clauses that I want modified into the body of the email. And then underneath, I usually say like, see my modifications in bold and italics. And then when necessary, I propose a small explanation. Sometimes that explanation can just be, I don't agree to this. Can we please cut? I think in a Vox contract, they had something ridiculous about social media. And I just said, I don't agree. And they just struck the whole thing. I'm negotiating contract now where it says if the story is canceled, the publisher still has a non-exclusive right to anything I've already submitted. And I was like, for this story, I don't agree because I'm bringing this to you. So sometimes it's as simple as that. Sometimes, I know some folks working on books or longer term projects work with an agent who help with negotiations. That can be really helpful. Not all of us have that. But that's a good place to fight for right grabs, for instance.
Yeah, I think there's a few important things in here. One, having the assistant, which is not terribly expensive, but sort of takes the emotional labor out of it for you a little bit and gives you some sort of backup for someone else to say, oh yeah, that's actually is unreasonable, right? Two, I think suggesting alternate language is easier than just saying, I don't like this. I think that's what happens a lot of times with contracts is we'll email whoever it is that is managing contracts for that publication and say, this doesn't work for me. In my experience, they'll just say, well, like, too bad. But if you can propose a slight adjustment, which is what we usually recommend with something like indemnity or rights, or even payment, that's a little bit easier for them to say yes to. So I think that's really important. Third thing is to find the actual person who is the contract person when you're having that conversation, or even the finance person, because sometimes it's not your editor. And that has taken me a while to learn too, right? That they may not even really understand what you're asking. Sometimes then it gets lost if it's like a whole game of telephone. So to just go directly to whoever their legal counsel is and have that conversation can be much easier. I have also gotten editors to agree to adjustments in an email, which means the email it constitutes an amendment. So even if the legal counsel is sort of, I don't know, bothered by what you're asking for, or you really, this happens a lot with a kill fee, right? So if I have written most of the story and I turn it in, and then for some reason they don't publish it, if the contract says I'm going to get paid like 25%, that seems unfair. And so I'll often talk with the editor and say, if I've given you a draft and it's, pretty close to done, would you agree to pay me 75%? They'll agree in an email. That counts. So there are sort of ways around this, I think. We can also talk about negotiating pay. Wudan, how do you have those conversations?
Yeah. I should say that, even in whatever you're negotiating, whether it's pay or contracts, that it's really helpful to not be emotional about it. Like, I'm never saying, this is ridiculous, I can't believe so many people signed this. It's just, this is what's there. This is what I want. Like, can we do that? So pay, I will say I am not negotiating pay very much these days because most publishers I'm working with pay my rates. And that's another way to selectively work with publishers that pay your rates. However, one thing that I will say is publishers are not going to go beyond 2x their going rate. Like, that's incredibly, incredibly rare, and I think would warrant a very special case scenario. But I think, recently, a few months ago, I did a story for a publication I was recently regularly contributing to, and normally they would pay roughly a project fee at $1 a word for the story, but the story would require a full day in the field, and my day rate is about $450 US dollars. And so I asked, like, actually, for this story, can we do a fee of this, since it would include a day of field work? And so sometimes a very simple explanation, or sometimes even stories that are shorter in word length but require a high degree of research, like, I think that's even justifiable. This is why I don't believe in per word rates, because per word rates do not reflect how much work actually go in a story. I think I think Jenny and I try to advocate for people to pick a project fee that works for them, that reflects the amount of work needed to produce a story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a good lead into thinking about pay and how much you should be asking for, because I think this is actually incredibly challenging. We did a whole webinar through the Writers Co-op a while ago about rates, like how do you know what to ask for? And everybody's assessment was that this is a little bit of I don't want to say magic, like sort of making it up. But there is a way to figure out what your hourly rate is and what you need to make, which involves figuring out how much you want to make per month, and then looking at how many hours you're going to work and using that to math out your hourly rate, and making sure that when you look at the project, you can estimate how long it's going to take. So if I get a feature story assignment and I look at it and I say, I think that's going to take me probably about 15 hours. My current hourly rate is $100 an hour. So what does that look like? Okay, I actually need to ask them for $1,500. And if they're not able to meet that, I need to figure out probably how to make it take me less time, which is when I would negotiate scope. So that is really helpful to have that number in your head and to take a moment to figure out how long you think something will take. This is when we recommend tracking hours sometimes, using a tool like Toggle, just so you can see, like, how long does a typical feature story take me? How long does an investigative piece take? How long does a Q&A take, right? Because like Wudan is saying, getting paid $1 a word for a personal essay that takes you 2 hours is very different from getting paid $1 a word for a feature story where you're going to interview 10 people. So what we want to make sure, and it will balance itself out probably over time, but what we want to make sure is that we're trying to bump up that rate where you're doing a lot of reporting, and being able to explain that to your editor and say, actually, I think this is going to take me this long, is a really useful way to have that conversation. So that's usually when I'm asking for a pay bump. I'm not just saying, pay me more. I'm saying, so I'm looking at the scope of work and it looks to me like it's actually probably going to take me about X amount of time. I usually charge about this amount, so that maths out to this. What does your budget look like? Do you have any room to have a discussion about this? I'll say that in an email. Typically, I'll hop on the phone if the email thread becomes long and there's a lot of back and forth, just because I do think it's easier to actually just talk with the editor. And then there's the question of what happens if they say no. What do you do? Which I think is an important question to talk about with negotiation. When do you walk away? When do you say okay to something that is less palatable to you? So, Wudan, what is your, how do you know when something is worth taking if it doesn't meet your standards of pay, or contract terms are kind of crappy? When would you say yes?
Yeah. Jenny, you talked about like why you would say yes to an assignment earlier on and the thing that you negotiate the most. What I actually negotiate the most now is timeline. Because I'm like, oh, the scope of work is fine. I can't buy more time like this week. It's just not possible. So can I have more time? Every negotiation is different. But I think when I go into every negotiation, I know what my walkaway point is. Again, I said I'm not negotiating rate at this point because a lot of publishers are meeting my rates. But I will negotiate timeline, and it's usually when there's no budge on timeline, then I walk. I'm also doing quite a bit of work for hire assignments recently, and so like recognizing that they are work for hire, which means and I think work for hire, some people get caught up in work for hire and say all work for hire agreements are bad. And that's not necessarily true, because if somebody comes to you, the freelancer, with a vision for a story that they want you to execute on, you're executing on the client's vision. And that is actually a work for hire project.
Yep.
And
work
you
for
can,
hire means it was their idea, right? That they're
exactly
offering to you.
It's more problematic if it's a big feature that you've been working on for years and you're trying to get a place. Like that's absolutely a place that I would push back. But that's to say, like, I go into every negotiating knowing like, oh, if they don't budge on this, I have to walk. Or like, oh, if they can't give me my audio rights, I would settle for a lower fee. Or just like knowing what it is and pick your battles, because you can't win it all. Like it's very unlikely that I will get everything I ask for.
Yeah, I think for me, I will occasionally say okay to a rate if I think it is a story that will sort of like give me a lot of fodder to write a bunch of other stories. So if sort of like I'm getting paid to do the first research in the first version of this story, and I might write on the topic in a bunch of other ways, I might say yes if it's a super prestige publication that I know will eventually help me get paid more down the line by other publications. But again, like Wudan, I have a walkaway rate, right? So I also am willing to walk away. And I think that is a big part of this. That is a total counterculture media switch to say, actually, I'm going to say no to this thing because it doesn't work for me, and believe that there are places out there that could meet my rates or that could help me write the story in a way that's protected. I like to tell the story of I was working on an investigative piece and realized that the company I was writing about had a history of suing pretty much everyone who wrote things about them, and went back and looked at my contract, which I had signed with a publication for a previous story but covered the rest, and realized I had signed an indemnity clause that meant that I would be liable to pay basically whatever legal fees occurred if the person sued me. The publication owned the story outright because of the contract, but I was on the line legally. And when I realized that, I had this decision to make about like, I was getting paid decently for this story. It's at a great publication. Do I A, keep working on it and take the risk, B, walk away and like basically lose money because I've already worked on this story and then have to rehome it and all this stuff, or C, do I try to negotiate? So I sat down with the editor. We had a long talk. He asked the legal team to change the contract. They said no. And I walked away because the cost to my business and my family could have been really aggressive. And so I think the only way you learn about these things, unfortunately, is kind of to be faced with moments like that where you see, okay, this is my line, right? This is my line that unfortunately does not feel safe for me to sign this, or it does not feel safe for me to continue working on this, or, I need to protect myself better. Now I don't sign contracts like that if I'm working on stories like that, but I didn't know before. You don't know what you don't know. So there's no shame in screwing up, because I also think it helps polish up your business practices in different ways. But for me, there is a sort of no-go zone now in terms of the liability aspect and what types of stories I'm willing to work on with what types of publications and how they're going to protect me. I care about that very much. I might accept lower pay if someone can offer me a contract that's a little better. And I will also say I'm working on personal essays now, and I don't sign contracts where the publication owns the piece in case I want to write about that stuff or take those essays and use it in the future, because it is my story. And so it feels bizarre that they would own it forever. But you'll learn, I think, also what your yeses are and what your nos are. These are very unique to the individual. Wudan, do you want to talk a little bit about like fear, scarcity mentality, some of that stuff before we move into questions, like why it's hard to negotiate and what we
Yeah.
recommend to help yourself be able to say no or walk away.
Yeah. I mean, people I think don't negotiate or don't tend to negotiate because I think there is this idea that freelancers are lesser than editors, and we must surrender to whatever they give us in if we want work. Um, that is not necessarily true. So one thing that really helped my mindset early on was, and I think somebody else said this to me, but even that sentiment, like it would be great to work together, I take as like we would be collaborating on a project. So the project is creating a story for our readers. It isn't really about me and it isn't really about my editor, but together we are working on a product together. And that made me see myself and my editor as equals. I think, Jenny's therapist early on was like, what do you have to do to legitimize yourself as a business? And she set herself up as an LLC, which then makes her see like more eye to eye with a business. So that's, I don't know what the equivalent is to an LLC in the UK, but that's a limited liability corporation in the US, which just means like you can be a business of one. And I am
And on
also
contracts, on contracts, then you're two businesses signing a contract. There is something mental about that for sure.
For sure. So it's leveling the playing field and being like, I have a voice in shaping the story as well. And I can also, negotiate for terms because businesses negotiate and negotiating is part of the business. And, I understand the sentiment of, oh, if I negotiate the contract, the rug will get pulled under me. That isn't really that has never happened to me. I've heard about it happening to other freelancers who say, that, oh, I I negotiated the rate and then the editor completely ghosted. That's fine, but then you as a freelancer would also be assuming that there aren't publishers out there who could pay you that rate that you want, which is not true because there's so many publications. So I think that's what Jenny is trying to say about the scarcity mentality, because acting out of scarcity means there's only this one opportunity, and if I don't get it and something like catastrophic happens, I can't put it somewhere else. There isn't better out there for me. And that is fundamentally false. You don't know what's out there for you if you don't try, if you don't put yourself out there, if you don't negotiate. So, or set higher standards and boundaries for yourself. But I think, Jenny and I always say, like, we can sit here behind our screens and yell that into the void or whoever we're coaching. But you really have to prove that to yourself. And so, like, track your negotiation wins with your editors and see what happens, right? Because most of the time you're probably, getting small things that you want, maybe not everything, but like some things should reinforce the idea that like you are capable of getting what you're asking for.
I love this. I think it's like a flip, right? Because we're sort of told something might come my way for my career, and if I don't say yes to it, I'm going to miss the thing that's going to make my career. I've had multiple people tell me that when I'm coaching them, right? That they're like, if I don't say yes to this, what if it's the thing? And like the secret is that there is no thing, and there's no pinnacle of our career really ever anyway. But like it's a flip, right? To say I'm going to figure out what I want first and then ask for that, and it is also surprisingly effective. Wudan and I love to give people that homework of like, you're a journalist, so go create a research memo about yourself and write down all the times when it has worked out, when you've pushed back or asked for better, right? Things like that. We call it the confidence log, but it's helpful because you can't be comfortable and negotiate. There is no way for both of those things to be true. You will have to be uncomfortable and afraid and negotiate to get something better. And so part of this is actually just learning how to deal with that part of being uncomfortable and being afraid. So some of these tools, like having this confidence log that you look at, to say to your brain, like, it's okay, we can trust me. I'm like, good, those things can help you get through those tough moments. But the reality about negotiation is it is a push. And if you're a freelancer, you already know what it's like to do risky things. This is another one. So yeah, let's why don't y'all start dropping questions into the chat? So we have about 20 minutes left and we'll start to address them. Let's see, do you think if other people settle for less, it makes it harder, or do editors take each case on its merit depending on their budget? This is a really good question. And I think gets to that sort of scarcity mentality, right? There's only enough for 2 people to win. In our experience, that's not necessarily true. It is maybe true that at one publication, an editor might use their budget for that month on those 2 people, but that does not mean you can't work with them next month, right? And it does not mean that there are not other places that also have room for you, but that is definitely sort of the prevailing mood of journalism. It's not unusual to think that is a part of it. What do you think, Wudan?
Yeah. I kind of actually interpreted this question a little differently, which is if other people just accept the standard rate of, say, like $300 for a 15-word story, does it make it hard for some upward movement? And I think yes, because, you know, the more people accept something on the other side, the publisher's like, well, there's no problem. Or if suddenly somebody negotiates, that looks more like an outlier. So I think, you know, negotiating is helpful in shifting the needle upwards to a different set of standards too. So yeah, but that's okay. Sorry, it's hard for me to look in the chat and also answer the question, but yes, I think right, it normalizes the rates. I coach so many people who are like, I just can't write like news analysis for $300 anymore when it takes me a week, and even though I live in a foreign country or, you know, post-conflict zone or whatever, like that doesn't even cover my security. That's just not sustainable. So yeah, like that 300, 400 has become standard across many web outlets, and I would love to know where it came from and how long it's been there and why it hasn't gotten pushed up and up and up, because that's really, you know, the value of a story of that type.
I do think, you know, there's a question here about, you know, saying to an editor, like, I need, you know, this is going to take me a lot of time, and them saying, well, just, you need to be more efficient. And I totally hear this. I think there are editors who do that and there are editors who don't. So one of the things that Wudan and I talk about a lot is there are publications that pay $200 a story. Approaching them and saying, I would like $800 a story, they're going to say no. That is what their boss has told them they're paying for that story. That's their budget. You don't want to be pitching those places if that's how much you need to make. And I think this is where people get stuck, actually, is that there are places where you can get paid better. And Wudan and I both do a mix of work for institutions, work for brands, work for traditional publications. There are places like university magazines that are not even going to blink to pay you $1 a word. And there are places that are mainstream media publications that are going to absolutely push back when you ask for that. So part of this is knowing which arena you're going to approach when you're asking for these things. So you don't want to pitch that investigative story to a place where the editor is going to say, oh, I guess that's on you, work faster, right? Because you won't be able to produce a product that you're proud of. You won't be getting paid enough. You won't have the support you need. So a lot of times Wudan and I say, like, part of this is actually thinking outside of the box and looking beyond what you may see as the like 4 or 5 publications you want to pitch, and seeing if there's actually other places that might help you with this, seeing if there are grants that you could get that would sort of supplement that so you actually are making enough, right? Thinking outside of the box instead of saying, what is the standard I have to adhere to, figuring out what your standard is and figuring out people who can meet you there. Like we said, it's sort of ballsy and confidence driven, and you start small. You start small by asking for small things, and then it gets easier to do these things where you're asking for more. But part of this is actually looking outside of the traditional industry. I mean, the lines are so blurred now, but like figuring out places that can pay you for what you're worth and will support how much time you need.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Wudan? Yeah.
No, I have nothing else.
Okay. Why don't you answer the one about like, if you don't get a contract, what are your rights? I think it's a good question.
Yeah, so this is a great question, one that we get a lot. Your rights are inherent. So if you don't sign your rights away, you can't give up your rights. There has to be a transfer of rights. So this is what I think, you know, Jenny and I were trying to say in terms of sometimes it's better if you just have a bare bones contract. because you retain your rights.
Mhm.
The one
The
annoying
default
thing
is to retain it. Yeah.
the one annoying thing I will say is, and this might apply to some of you because you're based in the UK, and the Guardian actually makes their contract public. So they don't give you, and I haven't actually written for them. I've been in talks with many editors there, but it never progressed because the rate didn't work for me for the scope that they wanted. So their contract is public, and when you get into an agreement with an editor, they have the deadline, they have the word count, and they have your fee. And at the same time, you're signing away everything else because it's public also. So they say that there is no contract. What I've been told is there is no contract to negotiate because all of that is public. That's something to look out for if you run into publications similar to a setup like the Guardian.
Yeah, I'm actually going to link in here to the Guardian's contract because
Mm-hmm.
Anna Quadrado sent that to me when I was asking her about this.
Mm-hmm.
So this exists online. So basically what Wudan is saying is you should check if they do have an existing contract. If they don't, then it defaults. You get paid for the entire project and you own all the rights. So some of the things in a contract that we look for that can be sort of red flags. One is signing away all your rights. So a publisher that just says, we own all of the things that you wrote in perpetuity. We own it forever. It does not belong to you. A lot of times what we try to argue for is some sort of limited license. So, okay, you can have first rights to it. You're the only person who can publish it, only publication who can publish it for 2 months, 3 months. Cool. Then I own it. Then I can maybe resell it, right? Things like that. So kind of trying to limit the scope of that ownership so that you can take some rights in some way or another. If you're doing work for hire, typically it is likely that they would just own it all because they came up with the idea. So that's one. I think pay is the other thing that we really talk about a lot. If you're going to look at like the Guardian's contract, you want to see how fast are they going to pay you? What happens if they pay you late? How much are they going to pay you? We typically say 30 days is something that is very, you would negotiate for that pretty standardly. And you want to know, are they paying you direct deposit? Are they mailing a freaking paper check that's going to take 3 months to get to you and get lost on the mail? You want to know all these things. So ironing out some of those details helps a lot with that fun thing that we could talk about more if y'all are interested about chasing down late payments, which Wudan has lots to say about. So those two things, and then indemnity, like I was talking about, so that concerns your liability, and then warranties are your promises. So what you are promising to do, the standard of work that you're promising to do. And that's usually not too problematic. The indemnity can be. So those are things that, like, if there is a larger contract like this, you want to be looking at. Okay.
Jenny, there was a question in here for you about kill fees. Like you agree on something, yes, but then in practice, you sink in more time and you and your editor agree on a higher kill fee. What is that like?
Yeah, so it's an amendment. It constitutes an amendment, that email does. And I usually have the editor say, this constitutes an amendment to the contract that Jenni Gritters will be paid XYZ. It's not just like, oh yeah, sure, Jenny, you can have this. Like I have her or him or them write this in language that sounds legal, right? Just because I think that does sort of solidify that the terms are in one place. And then something that Wudan and I have suggested, and I think Wudan has done to great effect, is if I've never heard of a legal team pushing back on that because it's far more effort than they want to spend typically for like $200 that you might need. But if they do, getting legal counsel, usually pro bono legal counsel, or, a law student at a law school to write you a letter, usually does the work to get them to back off. But it does legally constitute as an amendment, according to the lawyers we've worked with. Okay, what else? So if you didn't sign a contract, does the writer need to tell the editor the source that you're publishing in another publication? So I'm not 100% sure what it means. It depends.
Yeah,
right?
It depends. Like you don't want to publish a duplicate story in a competitive publication. I would be really clear about that. I think it's good from a journalism perspective. I think it's just transparency with your editor about what else, if anything, you're going to do with the story, or if you can perceive something being a conflict. Even when I'm using like similar sources, because they are the authoritative source in something, and I might reuse that later on. I give my editor a heads up, especially if those stories might publish in around the same time frame. I don't want like editor 1 to think that publisher 2 is scooping them in any way. So yeah, I just give them a heads up.
Yeah, I think we operate
But
under the idea
yeah,
that transparency is usually best. Your editors are people, they're going to understand. A lot of times when we're talking to folks, and this is not 100% in the bucket of negotiation, but when we talk about diversification and maybe writing 3 or 4 stories on the same topic, we talk about what's on the cutting room floor after that first piece is the easiest way to then take and do something else. You don't want to duplicate, and that's a little cleaner than writing 2. It gets complicated to write 2 stories with similar sources and similar topic at the same time. I think that can get a little dicey. I'm curious, Wudan, there's a question in here about sort of standard rates. Like when you read online that this is the standard rate for this kind of thing, how much do you trust that? And do you negotiate based on that, or do you negotiate based on the rates that you want to be making?
Yeah, if a publisher says whatever is their standard rate and it doesn't work for me, I go elsewhere. If it works for you, great. There might be like a little bit of wiggle room, but rates, there's so many other things to negotiate. So can that publisher pay for your expenses? Can that publisher pay for transcription? Can that publisher, whatever. Do you really want to work with this editor? Like, is that editor a relationship that you want to have? Like, those are some other things I would consider if that proposed rate is within, a reasonable range for you.
Yeah.
Everyone's ranges are different. So I think, there are quite a bit of other factors at play too, because it's not just rates that are negotiable. Like, you can negotiate your rights or whatever.
Yeah, I think also sometimes in this case, say I want to make $500 for a piece and they can only offer 300. I ask if they can assign me 3 or 4 pieces. So at least I'm not spending time hunting for more work. So I'm sort of bucketing together those multiple assignments. So like Wudan said, there is a lot of space here to ask for what works for you. But the idea is that you also then have to figure out what works for you, right? Instead of looking online to see what everybody else is getting, the question first is, what do you need to make for your business to be financially sustainable? What do you care about, right? Like right now I'm building out this part of my business that involves me writing personal essays. So I'm going to take a lower rate in order to get 3 or 4 of these published because that matters to me, right? But I'm not going to take a lower rate for the stuff that I'm super expert at because I already know how to do it. And so part of this is like that squishy mindset work of being introspective and figuring out what you want so that you can ask for it, which I think is important. We got a question in here about first British serial right licenses. Do you know anything about that, Wudan? This may not be something we can answer.
Yeah. No, I don't know anything about that. But licenses generally say this is a one-time use. They don't own the content that you create for them in perpetuity. And so a lot more common for photographers to license things out for a limited time period, or just give the people who buy their photos a non-exclusive license, so that photographer can still keep making money off of other licenses that they can. Yeah, so that just helps their revenue streams. It really does not work for photo, but I don't know about British serial right licenses.
Yeah, I think I used to work as an editor where part of my job was licensing content. We would usually do a 30-day exclusive license. That is a fantastic setup if you can get it. I actually did like a contract audit a while ago where I went back and actually looked at all my client contracts to see which content I owned and which I didn't that I had worked on in the past, because I had not been super I just hadn't been paying attention really to what the licenses were, what the exclusivity was, and realized that one client I had, which a place I've written probably 100+ assignments for, has a 1-year license. So I can actually take a lot of that content and do other things with it now, which is a really interesting prospect. So I would also check to see what kinds of agreements you have signed, if you have signed one. And good news, if you haven't signed one and there is no existing contract, you do actually just own this thing and can figure out how to repurpose it in a way that could be useful, that could bring in a little bit of money, could be passive revenue if you stuff it in a book or put it on Medium or what have you. That's a whole other discussion, but it is advantageous to own the things that you've written in some way, shape, or form. It is a good thing to negotiate for because it has a longer tail versus the sort of one-off cycle that we get onto. Let's see. I don't think there's any more questions in here. Do you want to talk about late payments a little bit, Wudan? That's probably something to address for like 5 minutes.
Yeah,
and then
totally.
finish up.
So things work a little differently in the UK. Basically, according to 1988 Act, y'all are in luck if you're based in the UK. The payment clock basically starts when you deliver the work or when you submit your invoice, and they have 30 days to pay you. Unless you and your client agree on a different pay schedule. And so there is also interest. And so that is kind of baked into law. And I think it's good for folks to know that it exists because it gives you the basis to fight for additional payment if the client is indeed late. I'm sure, like, you know, I know media lawyers in the US. I'm not really familiar with the UK landscape, but searching like UK media lawyer, what I've done in the US, and so if anyone in the UK is working with a publisher based in New York City, you're also covered by the Freelance Isn't Free Act, which stipulates that that client in New York City has 30 days to pay you. And if they're paying outside of the 30 days, they're also late. So there are a few like small things here and there that you can use in your favor. But I think like late pay, you know, first step is if you're getting a contract to specify how long a client has to pay you. And, you know, if you're late to paying your credit card bills or if you're late to paying rent, whoever you owe money to is charging you interest.
Yep.
Exactly. And so to sustain ourselves as businesses, I think we also should hold our clients to that standard. So yes.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, y'all are lucky that that clause exists. I think in New York here, it's progress that it exists as well. But this is that similar thing of pushing back actually flags to an editor, oh yeah, I do need to actually help my publication, you know, improve their processes so that we don't owe extra to our clients when we pay them late. So there are some actually enforceable things that you can use. Wudan and I like to use the strategy of just linking to some of these legal bits. If an editor is like, well, we don't really do late payments. It's like, well, actually you do legally.
It's actually the law. Yeah. It's the law.
Yeah, and that is a pretty quick way to also not take, it's not you being a problem, right? It's just you adhering to what the law is. And I think that's what people often get nervous about is I'm being a problem. They're not going to want to work with me again. I actually, in a lot of ways, working with editors through some of this stuff have become closer with them and developed better relationships with them and then had more work down the line. That's not always true. There are a few clients I've parted ways with because they've paid me so late and they were really angry about paying late fees. But the majority, I would say, it actually sort of strengthens your relationship to have more points of contact. So to push back, you deserve to be paid on time. That's important. It's the law. It's legally enforceable. And again, you can also have a pro bono lawyer write you a letter and that will fix things.
Yeah, I found that the threat of a lawyer is actually really powerful. I always say I'll have my legal team reach out if the late payment is an issue in accordance with blah, blah, blah section of this law. And then they're like, crap. I had a private question come through to me that asks if the New York City law is 30 days from submission or publication. It's invoice submission. So whenever that client first gets notice.
Yep. And that's a good point. That's another thing we like to negotiate for is invoicing upon approval of first draft rather than publication. So a lot of publications will default to like the clock begins and you can invoice when the story goes live. And that actually is something you don't have control over. So sometimes they'll hold it for 4 months and then you're not getting paid. So talking upfront, and that's something editors will be super amenable to. I've gotten that approved almost every single time. So once they've read your draft, they've approved that it's in like a good form to be published, you get to invoice. So you're invoicing based on your work schedule, not their timeline. I think that is a really useful way to get paid a little quicker too.
Totally.
Yeah. I just dropped the name of that act in there, so y'all can drop that in your emails to folks if you'd like. And then I also dropped a link to our business planning workbook. When Wudan and I coach people, this is where we have them start. If they want to start negotiating, it actually starts with this business planning bit, which has a section on money, like how much do you want to make, schedule, what kind of work do you want to do, all that jazz. So you kind of can get clear on that, which makes it a lot easier to ask for those things if you know what they are. So I'm going to drop that in there. We also talk about it on the podcast quite a bit. So if you listen, you'll ingest some of that as well, just for free. So yeah, I think we're rounding out on the hour. So should we close out, Wudan? Any last final thoughts on negotiation?
I mean, I think it's just, start somewhere. If that small thing is asking for a client to help transcribe or pay for transcription, they say no. Sometimes I'm like, do you have a transcription service that you can just plug this into? And sometimes they're willing to help with that. I do think negotiating is, also building rapport with different publishers, and showing that you can have a conversation that, I mean, negotiations are hard conversations, and I think going the extra mile to try and have a hard conversation with your client is, it builds the relationship. I mean, I'm reading Anna Sale's book on Let's Talk About Hard Things right now, and like that is the point of talking about things like money and rights and all of this, like that builds more closeness, and having solid relationships is also really important in sustaining your freelance business as well.
We always talk about client relationships like dating, and like when you have hard conversations with the person that you're dating, it actually does sort of build the relationship to be something that's more sustainable. And so I do like to think about that when it comes to negotiation, and asking for what you need. It actually improves the way you work together and makes it more sustainable for both people in the long term. The downside of that is that person might not be able to meet what you need, but as in dating, you probably wouldn't want to consider dating them for the next 10 years if they can't help you with what you need. So it's a good metaphor, I think, for thinking about that. And I also like to think of negotiation as kind of like a staircase, right? Like you're just going to take tiny steps. You're not going to like jump to the 8th floor all of a sudden. That's not really how this works. But those tiny little asks for something $50 more for 2 days longer, for, like Wudan said, like slightly improved, asking for transcription. These things matter, and over time they add up. So we'll leave you with that. And you can always find us on social media. TWC_pod is our Twitter handle, and we are often there. You can find both of us on Twitter. Our website is thewriterscooppod.com. So, and you can find the Writers Co-op wherever you listen to podcasts. We're on our 3rd season. We're actually doing live coaching this season, and a lot of it is conversations like this. I just recorded an episode about how to say no. So all things that most freelancers are dealing with. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Wudan, for the great advice. And thanks to everyone who attended as well.
Yeah, thank you. It was nice to meet you all.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.